Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, January 26th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the battleground state of Pennsylvania and how new polls indicate that Joe Biden is on a pathway to victory, with the most recent poll from Susquehanna University showing him with an 8-point advantage over President Donald Trump, and Quinnipiac University giving him a 3-point advantage. Now, the reason why I made this video is because when this poll came across my timeline on Twitter, I was very, very shocked. I think what we need to address first of all is the elephant in the room, that Joe Biden is not doing well nationally. He's down 4 points to Donald Trump in the head-to-head matchup between himself and looking at where we are in a bunch of battleground states, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia, Joe Biden is losing all of those states according to polls. And so when we see states like Pennsylvania come in with an 8-point advantage from Susquehanna, a reputable pollster and one of the more accurate ones in this state, Quinnipiac University, ditto for that, we find that this seems to be very, very shocking, to say the least, because Joe Biden arguably should be losing Pennsylvania based on where he is in the rest of the country. Now, as I have been saying for quite some time now, if the election was held today, I do think it would be very, very close, but I think Donald Trump would win. I think he's facing a lot of benefits with Joe Biden being unpopular and a lot of disenchantment from younger voters and more left-wing voters that aren't thrilled to vote for Joe Biden in this upcoming presidential election. But by the time we reach November, only time will tell how this sort of landscape ends up changing. But in Pennsylvania, things seem to be pretty consistent. While Donald Trump was in the lead for a period of time, Joe Biden seems to have reclaimed that lead in this battleground state, especially since there's a very, very important Senate election coinciding with this Pennsylvania race. I find it to be quite interesting to take a look at some of these numbers and sort of use them as predictive factors for this specific state. Unlike any other, Pennsylvania in the 2022 midterm elections and 2020 election and 2024 election seem to be consistently good for Democrats. It isn't just the presidential race that is really catching my attention, it's also the Senate race, in which you see that Bob Casey, the incumbent, is up by 7 points. And so I think that, for one, is a very, very interesting thing to bring up and raise. I think looking at a down ballot race that is actually outperforming the presidential, you can't really ignore that, especially from a swing state. Looking at the presidential, the numbers also look, like I said, good for Democrats, especially in recent polls here. You see, when I take a look at these numbers from November, October, and even early December, I'm a bit wary about using them as, sort of predictive factors for the upcoming presidential. I think as we are now getting close to a very, very realized electorate that we're in for a Trump versus Biden rematch, we're getting to a point where now numbers are starting to revert to their priors, as I like to put it, and have been putting it for quite some time now. I think we are seeing the direct impact of what it means to understand that this is a Biden-Trump rematch. That so many undecided voters that might have said they were unwilling to choose between Trump and Biden. For example, the Franklin and Marshall College poll that shows Trump at 42%, Biden at 44%. I find it hard to believe that you have 14% of the electorate that is truly undecided in a race that we have already voted on. I think looking at the more recent polls, you see similar numbers, but even then you start to see that numbers are getting closer to 50%. In no reality was there ever going to be Joe Biden at just 44% and Trump at just 42%. A lot of these undecided voters truly have made up their minds, but aren't willing to admit it, or simply don't want to think about it because they don't want to be faced with a rematch of Trump versus Biden. I think you're facing a very, very difficult electorate here where neither side of the aisle seems to be looking at this election like there are new opportunities and more of just a rematch between the last one, which is never good for morale or boosting turnout, to be quite honest. I do expect turnout to decrease. But Pennsylvania in specific, my focus on this state also is rooted in the 2022 midterm election results. I briefly touched on it, but I want you to see it so you can sort of visualize exactly why I think it is so important. In the 2022 governor's race, Josh Shapiro won this race by 15 points against Doug Mastriano, the Republican nominee for governor. And on one hand, Doug Mastriano was a very, very exceptionally far-right and exceptionally unelectable candidate, somebody who should have never even been put up in a swing state as the nominee. He was endorsed by Donald Trump, won the primary with the endorsement and a lot of support that he already had garnered himself, and was able to represent the GOP, but not in a positive way. He was somebody that was associated with the January 6th insurrection. He's somebody that's associated with a lot of COVID-19 conspiracies and QAnon conspiracies and very, very far outlandish claims that arguably make him unelectable. Josh Shapiro took advantage of that as the elected state attorney general and defeated him by a very trouncing margin. But the Senate race was one where I think it gets a little bit more interesting. The governor's race is one thing. Kansas voted blue on the governor's race, but would never vote blue on the presidential. But they did on the Senate level in Pennsylvania. That's the Supreme Court race. Another point, which I showed you a little bit early, but still coupled into this. The Senate race here is one that has a direct implication on the national composition of the Senate. John Fetterman, who at the time was recovering from a stroke, was facing off against a celebrity doctor, again endorsed by Donald Trump, who won the primary only on that endorsement. The margin was literally 1,000 votes out of 1 million cast. And so you see here that John Fetterman got 51% of the vote, not just a plurality, a majority, 51 to 46%. This was a telling sign for Pennsylvania. It's a state that, when put up with the task of making an impact on the national, unlike Wisconsin, a counterpart that voted blue in 2020, it voted for the Democratic Party. And Republicans actually held this seat. This was Pat Toomey's seat, a senator who had held this seat since 2010, I believe, a two-term senator, and never decided to run for re-election. I mean, very early on said, I'm pulling out of this race. And so John Fetterman announced, the lieutenant governor at the time, Dr. Oz, won the nomination. His runner-up in the GOP primary is now running again in 2024 and is expected to lose by potentially an even larger margin. So no good news there for Dave McCormick. But Pennsylvania voted by 5 points in favor of John Fetterman. And then came the Supreme Court election that I accidentally flashed you very early on. I don't think that's the right word. Maybe that has a bad connotation. Let's move on. Pennsylvania Supreme Court election results here showed that the Democrats were up by 6 points by the end of all the votes being cast. Now, this was not an election that, we saw, any type of national implication, but it was a statewide one and a first true test about the impact of a Democrat versus Republican in Pennsylvania when no real eyes were focused on this race. People were focused on Mississippi's governor's race, the Virginia legislative elections, Ohio's abortion issue, the Kentucky governor's race. You remember, we were talking about that for a long period of time. But the Supreme Court race in Pennsylvania sort of flew under the radar, and yet 3 million votes were cast. For context, in the Pennsylvania Senate race and governor's race, we had about 5 million, so lower turnout, but still representative of the electorate. And you found here that the Democrats won by 6. And so when I see Pennsylvania, I don't see a state that is, red by default, but Democrats have gotten lucky. This is a state that is arguably blue by default, and Republicans have gotten lucky. Because for a 24 to 28 period, consistent period, Democrats won Pennsylvania until the 2016 election. And while Donald Trump was hailed as this sort of, very, very big victor and huge savior of the Republican Party in the Rust Belt, he only won Pennsylvania by less than a point. And that isn't to say that that isn't impressive, right? You found here that, Joe Biden won Georgia by less than a point, won Arizona by less than a point. It was monumental. You're breaking this sort of generational curse on the Democratic Party in those states. And Donald Trump did the same for the GOP in these states. But it isn't enough to say that this is a Republican state by default and that these numbers don't really make sense. The only reason they don't make sense is because Joe Biden is losing more nationally. But that brings me to another point about 2022. We see here that John Fetterman wins by 5, and you might think, okay, if Trump lost this state in 2020 by a point when Biden was up by 5 nationally, doesn't that mean if Democrats are doing well here, the Democrats must have won nationally by a large margin? Not only did they not win by a large margin, they lost the popular vote by 3 points. Pennsylvania voted to the left of the nation by 8 percentage points. Fascinating, but largely in touch with what we're seeing in these 2024 numbers. And I think Pennsylvania in specific has been very happy with Governor Shapiro, Senator Bob Casey. Honestly speaking, Senator John Fetterman, who has a good approval rating for a Democrat who has made such a name for himself for being more left-wing. Someone who previously, no longer, but previously described himself as a progressive when he was running in the race and when he was lieutenant governor. I mean, you are talking about somebody who held a legalized marijuana and pride flag over the lieutenant governor's office, now being this very, very strong contender for a re-election bid and a very, popular one, even though I think there are very, specific instances where there may be times where these senators don't seem popular. They very much are popular. Josh Shapiro very much is popular, regardless of what you see on, Fox News or conservative media. At the end of the day, the numbers speak for themselves. And the numbers now are translating to a Joe Biden victory in this state. And now being up by 0.6% is by no means a comforting margin, but I certainly think it shows that there is a state here that Democrats are expected to do quite well in, especially if you're already outrunning the national numbers by this amount. Neighboring states like Michigan have Trump up by 5. Wisconsin has Trump up by 4. Arizona has Trump up by 5. Pennsylvania, though, has Biden up. It's the only state out of this list of battleground states that has Biden up. And so that's a good thing for the Biden campaign. Bad news everywhere else, but a good thing for the Biden campaign in this state. Because the map here is sort of going to shake out to around here. All the states that are on that list are also the states that are mentioned here. Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The rest of the states and districts are practically, going to go as they are already indicated unless there is some major revelation about either of the candidates, and I don't know if that's going to happen. And so with these remaining 93 toss-up electoral votes, the pathway forwards actually show that while Donald Trump is doing well in some of these states, he needs practically all of them if he's losing a state like Pennsylvania. Because the moment that Pennsylvania goes blue, it requires Donald Trump to do quite well nationally. It would mean that he would have to win North Carolina, which isn't too much of a stretch. He would have to win Georgia. He would have to win Arizona. But even then, he needs to crack Wisconsin or Michigan, because even Nevada doesn't even put him over the top. And humor me on this point. But while I do think that Joe Biden is not doing so hot in Wisconsin or Michigan based on polls, if Pennsylvania is voting blue, there's a strong chance that these two states are as well. But regardless, it shows that there is a pathway forward to a Donald Trump presidency without Pennsylvania, but it gets very tricky. Because let's say, for instance, Michigan is a state that voted for Gretchen Whitmer by 11 points, voted for Biden by 3 points, and although he is down in the polls, Michigan is a state where you find that Democrats could do quite well in. So Michigan goes blue. Pennsylvania goes blue. Where does that leave Donald Trump's pathway to victory? Well, I've already shown you how it happens, but the way for this to happen is actually quite extreme. It would require Donald Trump to win all of the same states he did in 2020, which isn't too much of a stretch considering he's doing better than he did in the last election. But it would also require victories in a state like Nevada, which Republicans haven't won since 2004, and even then, it was a narrow victory. And before then, quite a while. Arizona would have to be won back, which makes some sense and I think is certainly possible, but they just recently voted for Mark Kelly by 5 points, their governor to be a Democrat, all their statewide elected offices besides treasurer to be Democrats, and so I don't know necessarily if the GOP actually is doing as well as they are predicted to. The reason I say that too is because the polls said that Carrie Lake would win by the margin that Donald Trump is expected to win by. She lost that race. The polls also said that Blake Masters was going to win. They lost that race. The Arizona House races there were not supposed to be competitive, and yet 2 safe red states by characterization ended up being decided by less than 5 points. Not exactly as good for the Republicans as you might think. In Georgia, Raphael Warnock just won by 3 points. It's a state, sure, that I think Democrats aren't doing so well in, but not a state that is entirely out of Democratic possibility. It also means that Democrats would have to lose the state of Wisconsin, which could happen, but I don't know if it will. Because also what we saw is that in Wisconsin, there were some sleeper agents when it came down to the governor's race. The polls had indicated that Tim Michels was going to win. In a similar way, they are predicting that Donald Trump is going to win. And Tony Evers pulled out ahead. And so I think what we are finding here, that without the state of Pennsylvania, it would require Donald Trump to practically run the scoreboard, right? Go all across all of these states, win every single one of them, win every battleground, on top of, maintaining this presence in the states he is defending, winning Georgia, winning Arizona, winning Nevada, but keeping Ohio, keeping Iowa, keeping North Carolina, keeping Florida. And while that might not seem like it's something that matters, Donald Trump still needs to put effort into these states. Regardless of how lopsided you might think they are lopsided because the parties, respectively, have been lobbying them and winning them over for years on end. This isn't just because Donald Trump is likable to the voters in Ohio. He invested a lot more than Hillary Clinton did in that state, and arguably speaking, invested a lot more in the Rust Belt than she did. She didn't even visit Wisconsin after the convention, and he went there multiple times. There's reason some of these states did end up flipping to Donald Trump. It isn't just by chance. However, I do also think that looking ahead to 2024, the pathway for Donald Trump to win without Pennsylvania is very slim. It won't be a 306 margin like it was in 2016. Even if he does win the state of Michigan, it still doesn't get to that point. Regardless of what it is, Donald Trump sort of maxes out at this point. Every other state was decided by more than 5 in 2020. And realistically, I don't see many states swinging by more than 5. That's why I really don't entertain Texas and Florida as states that I expect to be true toss-ups in 2024. But again, only time will tell. This is all to say that the Pennsylvania numbers here are good news for Biden and good news for Democrats. In a lot and a sea of Republican polls that are doing very, very well for Donald Trump, this is their silver lining. But I think it is also an indicator that potentially there are pathway forwards for Joe Biden with Pennsylvania, with the Rust Belt, without maybe some of the states he won in 2020. This election is going to be exceptionally close as we start to see more of the criminal trials get back into mainstream conversation. This GOP primary practically coming to a wrap, as you can tell from my video earlier today about Nikki Haley, potentially dropping out. I think we are getting to a point where these general election polls will be very interesting to track, very interesting to watch. And as we start to see more and more people come to, this realization that it is going to be a Trump versus Biden rematch, I'm so fascinated to see what actually breaks down in terms of their ideas, in terms of how they are going to vote, why they're going to vote for their respective candidates, and what it means for this election and beyond, because there are significant impacts of it. And I think Pennsylvania will be the first state that we are going to cover very much in depth and will continue to cover throughout this election cycle. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below, subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.